There's a relief carved into the wall of an ancient Egyptian temple that, out of context, looks less like religious art and more like a wiring diagram. A long, tapered object resembling a glass bulb, a curling, snake-like filament running through the center of it. A cable connecting it to something that looks disturbingly like a power source. It's carved into sandstone at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, and it has been circulating for decades as, according to some, physical proof that the ancient Egyptians had electricity thousands of years before anyone credits them with even inventing the concept. Stand in front of the real thing today, and it's easy to see why the image took hold the way it did. It really does look uncannily, almost eerily like a light bulb. But that's exactly where this story gets interesting, because what mainstream archaeology has actually determined this carving depicts, and what centuries of independent researchers keep insisting it might actually be, sit on completely opposite ends of the historical spectrum. And this single carving is really just the entry point into a much bigger, much stranger question. Just how advanced was ancient Egyptian technology actually capable of being? And how much of what still looks impossible today has already been explained, and how much genuinely hasn't? Start with that relief itself, because it's the perfect example of how a real, physical, undisputed piece of ancient art can generate two completely different stories depending entirely on who's interpreting it. Egyptologists who study the full context of the Dendera temple walls point out that the so-called light bulb carving sits directly within a broader panel of unmistakably religious, mythological imagery, specifically depicting a lotus flower giving rise to a snake, a well-documented, extremely common symbol in Egyptian religious art representing the god Harsomptis emerging from a lotus blossom in the act of creation, with the surrounding hieroglyphic text supporting exactly that interpretation rather than anything electrical. The base of the so-called bulb in this reading is the lotus. The filament is the serpent. And the object some have identified as a cable is actually a symbolic djed pillar, a common Egyptian icon representing stability, positioned beneath the imagery the same way djed pillars appear throughout dozens of other, completely unambiguous religious carvings across Egypt. Independent electrical engineers and alternative researchers, on the other hand, have pointed to specific proportional and structural similarities between the carving and a genuine Crookes tube, an early form of electrical discharge tube, arguing the resemblance is too precise to be coincidental, and have gone further, proposing entirely separate theories involving the legendary Baghdad battery, a completely different artifact discovered not in Egypt, but in Iraq, as evidence that some ancient culture, somewhere in the region, understood basic electrochemistry. It's worth being straightforward here. The vast majority of Egyptologists firmly reject the electrical interpretation of the Dendera relief, and the religious reading is far better supported by the surrounding text and iconography. But the debate itself has never fully gone away, and it sets the tone for almost everything else on this list, genuine ancient evidence interpreted through two radically different lenses, with the truth sitting somewhere in the tension between them. Move away from that single carving, though, and into the realm of achievements that nobody seriously disputes, and Egyptian technology gets considerably harder to dismiss as simple ancient superstition. Long before iron smelting is believed to have existed anywhere on Earth, ancient Egyptians were already working with iron, and the explanation for how it turns out to be almost as strange as any fringe theory. In 1911, archaeologists excavating a pre-dynastic cemetery at Gerza, dating to roughly 3200 BC, recovered a set of small, tubular iron beads. For decades, their exact composition remained uncertain, but modern analysis, including detailed testing conducted by researchers at the Open University and University College London in 2013, confirmed something remarkable. The iron in these beads is meteoric in origin, meaning it came from a meteorite that fell to Earth, and the beads themselves show clear evidence of having been carefully hammered and worked into shape by human hands thousands of years before Egyptians, or arguably anyone else on the planet, developed the ability to smelt iron ore from the ground. This isn't disputed fringe science. It's published, peer-reviewed archaeometallurgy. Pre-dynastic Egyptians were deliberately identifying, collecting, and skillfully working metal that had literally fallen from space, understanding on some level that it was different from ordinary stone, and treating it as valuable enough to shape into wearable ornaments at a point in history most people assume was defined entirely by simple stone tools. Then there's the stonework, and this is where even mainstream Egyptology openly admits there are still real, unresolved gaps in our understanding of exactly how certain objects were made. Deep in the storage collections of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo sits a set of stone vases, vessels carved from incredibly hard, difficult-to-work materials like diorite and granite, with narrow necks and hollowed-out interiors that display an almost mechanically consistent symmetrical precision. Engineers and stoneworkers who have examined these vases, including the same Christopher Dunn, whose granite analysis at the Great Pyramid has fueled decades of debate, have pointed to internal tool marks suggesting the vessels were hollowed out using some form of fixed-point rotational cutting method, essentially something functioning like an early lathe, a tool most historians don't credit ancient Egypt with possessing. Mainstream archaeologists counter that skilled, patient craftsmen using simple stone drills, sand as an abrasive, and an enormous amount of time could plausibly achieve similar results without any advanced machinery at all, and experimental archaeology projects have made real, if slower and less perfectly symmetrical, progress replicating comparable vessels using exactly those primitive methods. Nobody has definitively settled the argument either way. What's genuinely true is that these vases exist, that they display a level of internal precision that's difficult to fully explain through purely manual methods, and that this specific unresolved question has been sitting quietly in a museum basement for over a century, largely unnoticed by the public, while far more famous mysteries get all the attention. Travel south from Cairo to the temple complex at Abydos, and you'll find what might be the single most misunderstood image in all of ancient Egyptian archaeology: a carved stone lintel that, when photographed at a certain angle, appears to show, unmistakably, the silhouette of a modern helicopter, alongside shapes that look remarkably like a submarine in some kind of aircraft. It has become one of the most widely circulated images in the entire genre of ancient technology speculation, and taken at face value, it's genuinely startling. But the actual explanation, once you understand it, turns this from an impossible anomaly into one of the more fascinating, provable examples of how ancient stone carving actually worked. The Abydos hieroglyphs weren't carved once. They were carved, plastered over, and then recarved with different text at a later date, a well-documented practice called a palimpsest, common throughout Egyptian temple construction, especially when a later pharaoh wanted to update or rededicate an inscription originally made under an earlier ruler. Over roughly 3,000 years, the layer of plaster used to smooth over the original carving eroded away unevenly, causing the edges of the older, underlying hieroglyphs to bleed through and overlap with the newer carving on top of them, creating an accidental composite image, made up of two completely unrelated inscriptions layered on top of each other, that happens to visually resemble modern vehicles purely by coincidence. Egyptologists have identified the actual, original hieroglyphs underneath, which spell out completely ordinary royal titles and religious phrases with no relation whatsoever to flying machines. It's a rare case in this entire field where the mystery isn't actually unsolved at all. It's fully explained, documented, and understood. It just happens to look wildly more exciting in a single, well-cropped photograph than the underlying, fully mundane explanation ever will. Not every impressive claim about ancient Egyptian engineering needs a fringe theory to make it interesting, though, because some of the real, fully verified achievements are honestly just as remarkable on their own. At the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Sahur, built around 2400 BC, archaeologists excavating the site discovered an extensive network of copper pipes, running beneath the temple's stone flooring, engineered specifically to drain rainwater and other liquids away from the structure through a genuinely sophisticated plumbing system. These aren't crude, improvised channels. They're precisely fitted, corrosion-resistant copper piping, representing what is currently recognized as the oldest known metal plumbing system anywhere on Earth, built and functioning correctly more than 4,000 years ago. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians developed and mastered a synthetic pigment now known as Egyptian blue, created by heating a precise mixture of sand, copper, and other minerals to an exact temperature, producing one of the earliest known human-made synthetic pigments in history. A genuine feat of applied ancient chemistry that modern researchers have only fully reverse-engineered and chemically explained in relatively recent decades. Neither of these achievements requires any explanation beyond skilled, patient, genuinely brilliant ancient engineering and craftsmanship. And honestly, that's part of what makes the constant search for hidden, more exotic explanations feel almost unnecessary. The verified reality is already, on its own, deeply impressive. Medicine tells a similarly two-sided story. On the exterior wall of the Temple of Kamambo, a relief has long been interpreted by some as depicting a tray of ancient surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and what some viewers have identified as devices resembling modern medical tools. Evidence, according to that reading, of a surgical sophistication far beyond what history typically credits ancient Egypt with possessing. The mainstream archaeological reading is somewhat more measured, but still genuinely fascinating in its own right, identifying the objects as ritual and votive offerings rather than literal medical equipment, though closely resembling real tools known from other Egyptian medical sources. And that's really the key detail, because Egypt's actual documented medical knowledge, independent of that one relief entirely, was already remarkably advanced for its era. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a genuine, extensively studied medical text dating to around 1600 BC, but believed to be a copy of a much older original, contains detailed, methodical descriptions of surgical procedures, wound treatment and anatomical observation, including what many medical historians consider the earliest known reference to the brain's connection to the rest of the body, along with startlingly clinical, non-magical, case-by-case diagnostic reasoning that wouldn't feel entirely out of place in a much later era of medicine. Ancient Egyptian physicians performed real surgical procedures, set fractures, and even based on skeletal evidence recovered from multiple sites, appear to have practiced early forms of dental work and prosthetic limb attachment. None of it required alien intervention. It required generations of careful empirical observation, passed down, refined, and formally recorded, exactly the way real medical knowledge actually develops. And then there's the engineering feat that might be the most genuinely staggering of them all, sitting not in a museum or a temple wall, but exactly where its builders abandoned it, still half attached to the bedrock in a quarry outside Aswan. The unfinished obelisk would have stood, had it ever been completed, at nearly 137 feet tall, weighing an estimated 1,200 tons, making it, by a significant margin, the largest single piece of stone ever attempted by any ancient civilization anywhere in the historical record. Work stopped when quarry workers discovered a series of cracks running through the granite, cracks that would have caused the entire obelisk to fracture and fail if extraction had continued. And rather than risk losing the project entirely, the ancient engineers simply abandoned it in place. What makes it such an extraordinary artifact today isn't that it was finished. It's that it wasn't, which means it preserves, frozen in stone exactly as it was left roughly 3,500 years ago. The entire visible quarrying process itself, the channels cut around its edges, the tool marks left behind. Physical, undisputed evidence of exactly how ancient Egyptian workers approached the almost unimaginable task of extracting a single, coherent, 1,000-ton block of solid granite from bedrock using nothing but dolerite pounding stones, copper tools for finer work, and an extraordinary, almost incomprehensible amount of coordinated human effort and patience. So where does that leave the actual question at the center of all of this? The one that shows like ancient aliens have built entire careers exploring. Was ancient Egyptian technology secretly, impossibly advanced, quietly hinting at outside intervention or a forgotten, more sophisticated predecessor civilization? Or does every genuine mystery on this list eventually resolve, the way the Abydos carving did, into a fully mundane, fully human explanation? Once enough, careful research finally gets applied to it. Honestly, the real answer, sitting underneath all of this evidence, is messier and, in a way, more interesting than either extreme. Some of what looks impossible turns out to have a clean, well-documented, thoroughly verified explanation, exactly like the palimpsest carving at Abydos. Some of it turns out to be even more genuinely remarkable, once you strip away the speculation entirely and just look at the verified reality, like a 4,000-year-old copper plumbing system still recognizable as functional infrastructure today, or a set of iron beads deliberately hammered from a meteorite thousands of years before anyone is credited with smelting iron from ore. And a small, stubborn handful of genuine anomalies, the internal precision of those granite vases sitting quietly in a Cairo museum basement chief among them, still haven't been fully, conclusively explained by anyone on any side of this debate, no matter how many decades of study and argument have been thrown at them. What nobody can honestly claim, looking at the full, complete body of evidence, is that ancient Egyptian civilization was simple, primitive, or unsophisticated. They were identifying and working extraterrestrial metal before anyone else on the planet is known to have managed it. They were engineering functional plumbing systems that wouldn't look entirely out of place in a modern building. They were performing documented surgical procedures with clinical, methodical reasoning, and they were extracting and shaping single blocks of stone heavier than a fully loaded jumbo jet, using nothing but hand tools, sheer numbers, and an extraordinary depth of accumulated generational engineering knowledge. Maybe every single mystery still standing eventually gets solved the ordinary way, through patient archaeology, careful chemistry, and enough time. Or maybe a handful of these puzzles, the granite vases most of all, are quietly waiting for an explanation nobody has proposed yet. Either way, the deeper you actually dig into what ancient Egypt provably, verifiably accomplished, the less you need alien intervention to be impressed, and the more you start to wonder what else, buried under a museum floor or sitting unnoticed in a storage room somewhere in Cairo, is still waiting for someone to finally take a proper, serious look at it.